about the aims of this lecture. Yesterday, in his presentation, Professor Miscoy talked about some interesting specific concepts, like concerning the EU and democratization, like, for instance, enlargement, for instance, conditionality. So, my first question for you is, does anyone know what conditionality is?
A set of primary conditions that the state has to fulfill in order to get accepted.
To get the membership.
Is
Yeah.
that we call it that?
Yeah, sure. So, this specifically, this is the condition put by the EU for the accession. But what is the content of this condition? Because it's
social, political, some economical conditions.
Yeah, economic condition, but not only. Political condition.
Human rights. And,
Human rights is part of the political condition. There is also administrative condition. You know, every country that won the adhesion to the EU must fulfill some specific administrative requirements concerning the European Union law. So, the aim of this lecture is to focus on the EU role on democratization through strategies, through its tools, and showing the evolution of the EU strategy concerning democratization of Central and Eastern Europe. So, you know, strategy and tools. We will talk about conditionality, we will talk about enlargement policy, and so on. So, first of all, a bit of history. As everyone knows, all the story of the Eastern accession to the EU starts during the 80s, when, you know, political and economic transformation, the end of communism, the beginning of the transition to democracy, all these processes of transformation, in a way, pushed the EU to react to what's happening in Central and Eastern Europe. So, the European policy towards the Central and Eastern European countries changed, moving, first of all, from structural aid, economic aid, then to some specific association agreements with political conditionality, and finally to the perspective of membership. So, as everyone knows, new membership in 2004, 8 countries, in 2007, 2 countries, Romania and Bulgaria, and 2014, Croatia, and other countries that are still in negotiation, like Macedonia, Montenegro, and Serbia. So this complex process of adhesion of most part of Central and Eastern Europe to the European Union was a long process, was a complex process, and must be explained. So, we will start with some concepts useful to understand what is the aim of this lecture. So, I will start with democratization and then Europeanization. Any one of you can provide me a definition of these two concepts in your words? Okay, so democratization is very, on the one hand, it's very simple to understand what is democratization. On the other, it's very difficult to define it. So, generally speaking, we talk about democratization when we have a change of regime. from the non-democratic regime to the democratic regime. Very simple. However, because this is more complicated, why country begin the transition to democracy? It's very, very complex. There are some structural causes, there are some proximate causes. The causes may be economical, maybe political, and so on, maybe international. And as Professor Miscoglio told you yesterday, democratization can be defined as the sequences of different phases: liberalization, transition, consolidation. It's not a linear process. There may be a regression, there may be a democratization may be blocked, maybe a reverse. But actually, we can define at least 3 stages of this process, starting from liberalization, when an authoritarian regime begin to introduce some civil liberties, some political rights, very limited, and then transition, when new structure, new institution, new actors of democracy take place, and then consolidation. And then, in some cases, crisis, as we have seen yesterday. So, why Central Eastern Europe is an interesting case? Actually, because we had democratization into 3 dimensions: political dimension, economic dimension, and in some cases also state dimension. Think about, for instance, states like Slovakia or the Baltic states. I have to build up a new state, a new institution. So, complex democratization divided into 3 phases, into 3 dimensions. And there are many ways to evaluate democratization and to evaluate state of democracy, the quality. One way, for instance, is the tools provided by Freedom House. It's very interesting, very discussed tool, but useful in some way. Freedom House is an international organization that provides evaluation of democracy using 2 dimensions: political rights, civil liberties. So you have from 0 to 8. When 8 is like authoritarian regime, when 1 is democratic regime. And in this way you can see the change, the trend during the years. For instance, with Poland or the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe. Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia. So, why? This is an important thing to look at. Because we see it, we see a trend in this stage, starting from the end of the 80s, during the 90s, up to date. And this we can call it democratization. So, what about Europeanization? Do you have any idea about it?
It's like the implementation of European norms and values on national levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just the transfer of European law, European norms, European values also to the national level. Sometimes to the sub-national level. There is a common definition of Europeanization, very complex, you can see it, as processes of construction, institution, and institutionalization of formal and informal rule. So transferring rule from EU levels to national and subnational levels. And Central and Eastern Europe is very interesting concerning Europeanization, because usually in the Europeanization process we have not strong conditionality. When we talk about Europeanization of member states of the EU, we have not strong conditionality. However, with Central and Eastern Europe, during the enlargement process, conditionality was strong because of the accession, because countries had to fulfill those requirements. So that's why Europeanization with member states is different from Europeanization with candidate countries. The difference is actually conditionality. So during the 90s, we had two processes interacting in Central and Eastern Europe. On the one hand, democratization. On the other hand, Europeanization. So on the one hand, the construction of democracy at domestic national level. On the other hand, the role of the EU, the role of an external actors with its influence, with its strategies, with its logic, with its tools. So that's why it's important to look at the impact of the EU. That's why it's important to look at the evolution of new strategies and tools. So we can start actually with the changes in Central and Eastern Europe, the end of Tomini's, the beginning of transition. Just following this, there was a reaction to changes in the European Union to address in some way this new situation. For actually three reasons. The EU had to change its politics, its strategies of enlargement, because enlargement was an old issue, starting with the 60s, with UK, Ireland, Denmark, and then Spain, and then Portugal, and then Greece, and then Central and Eastern Europe. The difference is that with Central and Eastern Europe, almost everything concerning the enlargement policy changed. And why? First of all, for the first time, enlargement was to an entire region. The other times was to a single country, two countries, three countries, Spain, Portugal, Greece. But for the first time, there was the need to enlarge the EU to almost all Central and Eastern Europe. So also the strategy had to be changed, also the tool had to be changed. Second reason, the heritage of communism. Those countries had 50 years of communist rule, maybe more. Unlike the other countries of Southern Europe or Northern Europe or Western Europe, there was the heritage of communism. So institutional structure, institutional policies, cultural habits, and so on. First is the economic differences. The economic divide with the western part of Europe was far broader than during the past enlargement. So that's why all strategies had to be changed. All tools had to be changed. And what's happened? Three things, actually. The first one was the institutionalization of the enlargement policy. What does it mean? It means that for the first time, the enlargement policy became regulated by norms, regulated by procedure deal by institution, but the European institution. The other times, with, for instance, the southern enlargement or the northern enlargement, these policies was deal by member states with intergovernmental negotiation. For the first time, this policy is deal by the EU, by the EU institution, with specific procedure, with specific strategies, and specific tools of it. And that's why communitarization of the enlargement. For the first time, the EU Commission acquired a central role in negotiation. Before, it was the member state who played all the game. Now, it's the Commission who is the central actor of negotiation with member states. And the third change is increasing complexity. So, as you can see before, new tools, new strategies, not easy. But actually the main change, the most important change concerning our objective is democratic criteria for membership. Democratic criteria for membership was introduced for the first time with Central and Eastern Europe. Before, it was, like an informal rule. No authoritarian countries can become part of the European Union. But actually, with Central and Eastern Europe, this became part of the European Union law. This became part of the European Union strategy. An explicit rule, an explicit requirement. And that was fixed in 1993 in Copenhagen, the European Council of Copenhagen, called Copenhagen criteria. So, as we've seen before, Copenhagen criteria are very, very complex. There are economic criteria, there are political criteria, administrative criteria, but we will focus on political criteria. So, political criteria can be divided into two basic dimensions. First one is democracy and the rule of law. The second one is human rights and protection of minorities. In the first dimension, we can find some sub-dimension about the parliament, about the executive, about the judicial system, and about anti-corruption measures. Concerning the second criteria, we have civil political rights, we have economic, social, cultural rights, and we have minority rights. So, every country that applied for the membership had to respect these requirements. When a country applies to the EU to become a member of the EU, the application is evaluated by the European Commission through a process called screening, when the European Commission provides an assessment of all these criteria, and obviously also the economic and administrative criteria, and provide a final assessment, a final judgment of about the preparation of the country. This judgment is presented to the European Council, and finally the European Council can decide if the countries can start negotiation or not. Usually the judgment of the Commission is respected by the European Council. In every case, when the European Commission said, no, we cannot proceed with the negotiation, the European Council accepted this conclusion. In this history, there was only one case when the European Commission said no, and the European Council said yes. Do you have any idea for which case it is? Any idea? So it was with Greece in the 80s for economic reasons when the Commission, the judgment of the Commission evaluation was negative. And the European Council, for political reasons, decided to admit Greece to negotiation. But for Central and Eastern Europe, in every case, the evaluation was, we will see, positive, except for one case. But, okay, as you may notice, there's a problem with this criterion. Which is the problem for you? When we are talking about democracy and the rule of law or human rights, for instance, executive judicial system, what's the problem with the implementation of this criteria, with the evaluation of this criteria?
I guess like too abstract that you have no exact threshold, or you can say if something is right or wrong exactly.
Yeah, sure.
And also the judicial systems differ from country to country.
Yeah.
But these criteria, I have a question. Are there general criteria? Because I know when Romania exceeded, we had points, like 30 to 33 points.
So you see that this is the main problem of this criteria, the political criteria of Copenhagen, is that they are too generous. When we talk about parliament or executive, the main requirement of the EU is the smooth functioning and the correct functioning of institutions, of democratic institutions. It's a simple evaluation, it's a simple monitoring of this dimension of the executive, the parliament, of the judicial system, but without any threshold, any benchmarks. So that's why it's very difficult for the EU to evaluate the real state. But this is another problem that we can investigate after. There are also other things. Political criteria are the main breakthrough, the main innovation. There are also other innovations in the EU strategy. A new role for the EU Commission. So when the new Commission began to play a central role in negotiation, and new tools like the FAIR program, economic assistance and political assistance, association agreements, the regular reports. Regular reports are the main tool used by the EU Commission to evaluate each year the candidate country. Other administrative programs like IELTS, and for instance, other institutional innovation at the EU level, the creation of the general direction of enlargement. Because before, in the other negotiation, enlargement was dealt by different EU Commission directions. And for the first time in 1997, the European Union created general direction, only focus on enlargement. So, a lot of innovation for Central and Eastern Europe enlargement due to the three effects. An enlargement to an entire region, an enlargement to countries that had 50, 60 years of communist rule, and enlargement to countries with a huge economic development, so that need economic reforms. So, actually, this criteria was set up in Copenhagen in 1993, and after that, negotiation began only in 1997. There was only a case where the evaluation of the EU Commission was negative in 1997. It was with Slovakia. With Slovakia in 1997, when, for instance, Romania and Bulgaria was in some way rejected because of economic reasons, they started negotiation only in 2000. With Slovakia, the rejection was for political reasons, concerning the political criteria. Slovakia submitted the application in 1995, and then, because of the authoritarian behavior of Prime Minister Vladimir Mecha, the process of approaching to the EU was blocked. Even if the European Union, the European Commission tried to produce a change, tried to influence the Slovakian government through informal pressure, other warning, formal demarche, but without any consequences. So that's why in 1997 negotiation was stopped with Slovakia until the election of 1998, when Vladimir Mecha, Prime Minister Mecha, lost the election and was replaced by another coalition, a pro-European coalition. So it was the first application of the political criteria, and the first time when political criteria was used to block negotiation with the country. So concerning, the pre-accession, conditionality actually is strong, because strong even if too general, as we have seen before. Even if there's no possibility of direct change with the EU pressure, the Commission play a role, a gatekeeper role, so decide who can begin negotiation. If a country has a problem with political criteria, negotiation will block. That's very simple. The problem is that this is not technical, it's a political decision. Just because of the criteria that are too general, too vast to be evaluated in a technical manner. So, if we consider the enlargement process as a process divided actually into 3 stages: pre-negotiation, negotiation, post-accession. The first stage of pre-negotiation has its conditionality very strong, because, as the example of Slovakia showed, if a country has some problem, in the case of Slovakia was the problem of the behavior of the executive and authoritarian behavior, no respect of the opposition, problems with the rights of minorities. If there are some like this problem, it's actually probably that the negotiation will be stopped before starting negotiation. So the problem is in the second stage, the stage of negotiation. Because, as we can see, the reports of the Commission with this different dimension, human rights, minority rights, or democracy and rule of law, are too general. And the activity of the Commission, every year the Commission produces a report on the state of democracy of those countries. But this is more, an evaluation, a general evaluation and monitoring activity, without any sort of strong conditionality, strong sanction. As a EU official said in an interview, the EU Commissioner had the impression to preach without a clear Bible. What does it mean? It means that we said to candidate countries something about stability of institutions, something about the importance of rule of law, but we don't have specific criteria. We don't have specific requirements. We don't have specific threshold to evaluate if a country is in or out. So, and even for this reason, the result of negotiation was very different concerning all countries in Europe. Some countries concluded negotiation with fulfilling all of these criteria. Some other countries have more problems. And that's why it was difficult to assess if the country was prepared or not. And that's why, actually, the experience of Central and Eastern Europe negotiation was very useful for the EU because it allowed to a fine-tuning of the EU strategies. Just because of these problems, just because of the lack of, for instance, threshold, for instance, specific requirements. And in 2005, just after the end of negotiation with the most part of Central and Eastern Europe, the EU Commission started the process of fine-tuning of its strategies. And so that's why new specific benchmark concerning political criteria was introduced. That's why the political criteria was incorporated in the European Union law. And that's why the EU Commission created 2 new chapters of negotiation. You know, during negotiation you have 45 chapters. Each chapter for every part of the European Union law. And the EU Commission introduced 2 new chapters concerning political criteria. One judiciary and fundamental rights, and one on justice, freedom, and security, with specific benchmark, with specific requirements, with this evaluation scale for every country. So, in general speaking, after the experience of the enlargement to the east, conditionality during negotiation was strengthened. And finally, all instrument of influence, instrument of session, of financing, of pre-accession was merged into a single instrument called IPA. So every procedure was simplified, every strategy was merged into a single strategy. And that's before the final part. And so the reason of this fine-tuning was first of all the difference between the candidates of 2004 and 2007 and the new candidate countries, like for instance Macedonia, like for instance Montenegro, and so on. So concerning rule of law, concerning stateless, nowadays there are more and more problems, so that's why EU introduced all these changes and strengthened this conditionality. The second reason was the fact that the enlargement to the east was called Big Bang enlargement. So it was the idea that there was the historical need to enlarge to the east. So in some case, the evaluation or the final assessment was dependent on this, this main objective to reunite all Europe. And the third reason was related to a learning process, process of understanding, process of learning just after the failure and the problem of Eastern Enlightenment. So it remains the post-accession. What we can see is that actually the EU strategies and the EU tools are always lagging, behind the evolution of the events. As we can see, in the 80s, there is this change due to transformation of Central and Eastern Europe. And then there is the fine-tuning of 2005. So every time there is an attempt to adapt instruments and tools to the new situation. And that's why every time there is some problems, some in the EU strategy, some limitation of the EU strategy. The cooperation and verification mechanism is an example. This was a mechanism introduced by the EU for Romania and Bulgaria after the accession. Why after the accession? Because the EU had the impression that those countries had still some problem on judiciary and anti-corruption. So that's why even after the accession, even after Romania and Bulgaria became member states with rights and obligations of other member states, the EU Commission introduced this monitoring tool, to look at the reform on judiciary and the reform on anti-corruption. And this is an example of the evolution that is still ongoing of the EU strategies during the enlargement. So every time there is a problem, lack of progress of Romania, Slovakia, and Bulgaria with judiciary and anti-corruption, problem, reaction, introduction of this new mechanism, cooperation and verification mechanism. But without any practical effects or any assumption, because this mechanism used all member states. So there's no conditionality as before, And there is another problem concerning a possible democratic crisis. Yesterday we have talked about democratic regression, democratic crisis. We have seen many examples, but what happened actually? I don't want to enter in this debate, but what happened when democratic crisis occur, if the democratic crisis occur with the member states? So, after the enlargement process, when a country is completely a full member of the EU, so the problem is that, on the one hand, there's no conditionality. Before, there was political, economic, administrative conditionality. Now for member states, and on the other hand, the EU option, the EU tools are very limited for practical reason, for political reason. It's very difficult to address an issue as democracy with the member states. that has the same right and obligation of the other member states. And for technical reason, because there are no tools, no way of influence. So, if we can divide the enlargement process into 3 stages: pre-accession, pre-negotiation, negotiation, and post-accession, we have seen that we have a strong conditionality, political conditionality in the first part, a weak conditionality in the second part, and no conditionality at all in the post-accession. And this can be a problem. And this is really embedded in the current political and legal integration. So, what about conclusion? We have seen the evolution of the EU strategy and rules of democratization. We have seen that EU strategies started in Central and Eastern Europe, started with structure, with economic aids, and after this evolution became a real policy, a real enlargement policy. The different results that we can see in the member state of this influence, of the EU influence, depends on the one hand on domestic causes, on domestic factors. So on the one hand, the differences depends on the process-specific path of democratization, transition and consolidation. But on the other hand, the differences depend also on the limits of the EU action, on the limits of the EU strategies, on the limits of the EU tools. So there is an asymmetry that we can see between a pre and post. This is actually clear. And the main difference is the lack of conditionality in the post-accession period. So that's why there are still a problem in dealing with democracy with member states. The EU is able to influence democracy and democratization of candidate countries in a very effective way in some cases, with a strong conditionality. But with member states, it's a very different story. So if we can resume this process, we see that the critical juncture of the 80s, so the end of communism, transition to democracy of Central and Eastern Europe, produced a change at EU level. And the EU level was obliged to introduce new measures, new strategies, new tools for dealing with this new issue of enlargement to the East. The impact of the EU strategies was very different concerning the different member states. And that's why the EU was obliged to fine-tune of the strategy, to adapt, to innovate, to introduce new tools, to introduce new instruments. And so, the final question concern, is it time for a new critical juncture? I mean, if the political criteria was introduced at the beginning of the 90s just because there was the need to address the problem of the enlargement to the East, just because this was a huge, a very complex problem that needed new strategies and new instruments. That's why political criteria was introduced. But now, if we can imagine a crisis of one member state, I mean, we have seen, starting with 2008, with the economic crisis, a new role for the EU concerning the economy. For noting that the EU now play a very important role in some European countries. I'm talking about all Southern European countries. I'm talking about Greece. You know, because of the economic crisis, new instrument was introduced at European Union level. And so my question is, do we need a democratic crisis of one member state? Or, for instance, some democratic regression, or even democratic collapse? Do we need some situation to have new instrument, new tools, and new strategies for the EU? This is my final question. So, thank you very much.
So thank you very much for the lecture. Now, questions. Do you have any questions? Here, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for your presentation. That I have asked you about. I would like to ask about this fine-tuning. Don't you think that this is not a contradiction to your argument that the negotiation phase was of the sort of weakest conditionality, or not even no conditionality, as you stated? Because if you look at the development in Slovakia, and if you look at the regular reports from 1998 till 2003, you see that most of the development actually took place in this phase.
Yeah.
I actually do not believe that the strongest conditionality was pre-negotiation. I believe that the